This is Intercepted.
Welcome to Dropside News. I'm Murtaza Hussain. Over the past several weeks, the Trump administration has sent signals that it plans to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. Since Russia invaded the country in 2022, the conflict there has killed hundreds of thousands of people, while laying waste to huge portions of the country. Ukraine today is depleted and exhausted by the war. But while many welcome the prospect of a negotiated ceasefire, there are deep concerns about the Trump administration's plans for how to bring an end to the fighting. Trump has demanded that Ukraine provide natural resources, including precious rare earth minerals, to pay back American financial support for the war. He has also not clearly laid out his vision for a sustainable peace in the region that will prevent the war from simply restarting again in the future. Keep in mind that the conflict began not in 2022, but with the 2014 Russian invasion of the Crimean Peninsula. There are fears now that the U.S. may impose a diplomatic agreement onto Ukraine that results in crushing economic debts that permanently immiserate the country, while merely delaying the next round of bloodshed. To discuss the current status of the war, the ongoing negotiations, and the historical background to the invasion, we are now joined by Rajan Menon. In addition to being an expert on Ukraine, Rajan is a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. Rajan, welcome to Dropside.
Thank you, Murtaza. Thanks very much.
So, Rajan, in the past few weeks, we've seen a flurry of developments vis-a-vis the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. And most recently, in the past week or so, there have been escalating discussions of possibly an agreement to end the war. Now, the terms of this agreement seem to still be in flux at the moment, but they suggest that the U.S. may offer, if not a security guarantee, but some sort of vague assurance to Ukraine of its political existence in the future in exchange for what looks to be, on the face of it, quite sweeping economic concessions from Ukraine to the U.S. Russia, for its part, has welcomed these developments and welcomed what seems to be a more conciliatory view from the Trump administration towards Moscow than its predecessor had. I'm just curious, how do you make sense of what's going on at the moment diplomatically between the U.S. And Russia over Ukraine? And how are Ukrainians as well viewing these events?
So the first thing to note is that the advent of Mr. Trump has meant a sea change in American foreign policy toward Ukraine. Under Biden, the policy was not to give them everything they wanted, but to give them substantial amounts of weaponry. So about $64 billion since the invasion, which began on February 24th, 2022, more than the rest of American allies put together. Now, Trump has not said he would end weapons support, although I wouldn't be surprised if he did. But what he says is, I want to bring this war to an end. And he's given two reasons. One is too many people are dying and this is a useless war. But much more importantly, I think this approach of Trump to Ukraine reflects his overall view of the world. That is, that the United States in this particular case doesn't have a dog in the fight. He said, we can walk away from Ukraine because an ocean separates us. And he believes, I think, that the war began because Ukraine was going to get into NATO. Putin was provoked by that. And therefore, the way to end the war is to shut Ukraine out of NATO and to have a deal in which Russia controls, if not all, then most of the territory it holds. Now, you mentioned the deal in the making between Trump and Zelensky on raw materials. It's not quite clear to me what that means. Does it mean that the U.S. will have a stake? Trump wants $500 billion, which would be about 7 times the aid that the U.S. has given Ukraine since 2022, February. Or does it mean that plus an agreement to continue supplying Ukraine with weaponry? If the latter, I don't think the Russians are going to be all that excited because it means a continuing U.S. security commitment to Ukraine. What we can rule out completely is any prospect of American troops on Ukrainian soil to guarantee Ukraine's post-war security. That will be up to the Europeans, and Trump has been very clear on that.
Rajan, you mentioned something very important that there's been this tremendous death toll in Ukraine since the start of the war in 2022. Some of the figures remain in dispute, but some reliable estimates from Western security services have said that it's well into the six figures for both sides in terms of killed in action and wounded in action, and could even be greater than that. Something that maybe Europeans have not seen in terms of a scale of death since the Second World War. Me and you have both been to Ukraine. You've been more than I have, and you've been closer to the front lines in some cases in the east. Can you talk a bit about what exactly the situation is in Ukrainian cities and what you observed on your visits there in terms of the impact of the war on Ukrainian society?
Right. So just to put this into context, Murtaza, you know that Russia has a population of about 152 million, Ukraine about 40 million. So Russia's population is more than three times as large. So even if the casualty count is roughly equal, that is to say, each has lost somewhere north of 500,000 people, the hit on Ukraine, demographically speaking, is much, much bigger. And you've been there once, and I'm sure you've seen evidence of this. It has been very, very traumatic, the war, in terms of its impact on society. So even in Kiev, and I'm sure you experienced this, air raids, air raid warnings are a dime a dozen. Happens all the time. If you go to the front lines, that is to the northeast in Kharkiv province or to the east, close to the combat zone in Donbas. Donbas consists of the provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. The destruction is not quite like Gaza, but it comes pretty darn close. Now, what that means is that even if the war ends on terms that Ukraine deems to be reasonably favorable, the reconstruction costs are going to be massive and probably will take a generation. The last estimate I heard, and that's about a year and a half ago now, was from Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal of Ukraine, who said it could be about $750 billion. So the current generation of people who are, say, in their 30s may not live to see their country made whole. When the refugees come back, whether refugees from outside or internally displaced people, they have nowhere to go because everything they knew as a neighborhood, schools, churches, shops, hospitals, in large part, these have all been destroyed. So it is an enormous task that faces Ukraine, even if there's a political settlement that it can, in the end, live with.
Yeah, what you're describing is very visceral when you're there, even in Kiev, in the capital and so forth. There is destruction of certain neighborhoods, but you see evidence in the population, a tremendous number of people who are amputees, young men and so forth who served in the war. And the air raid sirens are constant. I think much of the country, which is not destroyed, still has sleep deprivation from nightly air attacks, many of which result in fatalities as well, too. It's been a tremendous a negative, unbelievably tragic impact on the Ukrainian population. So for our listeners, obviously the war started with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. There was pretty significant and successful Ukrainian resistance to the invasion for the first year or so, you could say. Ukraine mounted a counterattack aimed to reclaim some of the territories that had been lost in the initial phase. The counterattack did not really achieve that goal. And now there is this sort of grinding stalemate, which seems to favor the Russians, and they seem to have been gaining ground more in the past year or so, you could say. Rajan, can you tell us a bit about the actual military situation right now and how that situation relates to the political discussions taking place at the moment?
You gave a terrific sketch. The first year of the war, 2022, was the most successful for Ukraine. They pushed Russia out of the north, the northeast, and from the occupied part of Kherson province in the south. 2023, the counteroffensive did not go well. 2024 has been the worst year for Ukraine and the best year for Russia in terms of territorial losses. So Russia has made a net gain of about 1,600, give or take, don't hold me to the number, square miles. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of Long Island. Now, from that, if you want to net it out, you have to minus what the Ukrainians hold in the Russian province of Kursk that they invaded in August and still maintain control of about 40%. They have about 400 miles. So in absolute terms, the land does not that Russia has gained in 2024 may not look huge, but the Ukrainians have certainly been fighting on the back foot in two respects. First, it took a very long time for the next tranche of American military aid to be approved. It was not approved until, I believe, April. Deliveries didn't start until about the fall. So for much of this past year, 2024, Ukraine was fighting with virtually nothing. The artillery exchange ratio was about 10-1, manpower advantage about 5-1. So that's been a problem, and it's enabled Russia to make significant ground. On top of that, because the Russians, although they're not without manpower problems, we can talk about that later, can bring more and more men to the field to man what is about a 1,500-mile front. The Ukrainians cannot populate that entire front and have to pick and choose where they want to defend. And the Russians have been able to sort of overpower them by sheer mass. Having said that, on certain days in the end of last year, the end of 2024, Russian losses were up to about 1,500 casualties a day. So they have made enormous sacrifices to achieve Putin's objective, which is to seize as much territory as possible. Now, bear in mind that Putin's announced aims are to annex all of Donbas, so all of Lugansk and all of Donetsk, and all of Zaporizhia and all of Kherson. There's only one province he controls fully, and that is Lugansk. So he hasn't achieved his goals. He's not close to them, but there is no question that the war has tilted in Ukraine's direction. When I first went there soon after the war, Ukrainians were signing up in droves to defend their country. Now, manpower problems are very, very severe. People are trying to avoid the draft, and there is a sense of demoralization that's set in, not so much at the front, but certainly in Ukrainian territories at large. You and I both know one person who is a very strong Ukrainian patriot. I never thought I would see her leave, and not recently she decided to move to Europe. And I asked her why, and she said, we're just tired and we're just worn out. So that is roughly the situation militarily and psychologically. And the question is, can Zelensky sign a peace deal that leaves Russia holding a large amount of territory? If he gets a security guarantee from the United States, he can do that much more easily than he can if he doesn't. It's going to be a hard sell.
You know, one thing that I remember from the period in the first year of the war was there was this really heady optimism about Ukraine because of how it was performing militarily, to the great surprise of many observers, because obviously it's a smaller country, it's fighting a much larger, more sophisticated neighbor. And it seemed that almost a sense that the entire Russian military effort may collapse because it seemed to be inept, and it was, there were all these debacles taking place in the east that suggested a level of high disorganization and low morale. But it seems like the Russian military has changed somewhat in the past 2 years, its practices and so forth. And it almost reminds me of historical wars that Russia fought, where it seemed weaker at the beginning and then stronger as the war got on. Do you have a sense of what exactly changed on the Russian end to improve their military effectiveness such that they are making these steady incremental gains against Ukraine, even at this great cost of manpower?
So in the first year of the war, 2022, they made a calculation that they would have a force not large enough to conquer even significant parts of Ukraine, let alone all of Ukraine. Ukraine, as you know, is the largest country by land area in Europe, excluding European Russia. Very big place. You've driven through it. So what they thought was they would have a force that would take some parts of the east and southeast, but focus on driving into Kiev, achieve a regime change, put somebody beholden to them in power, and that would be it. Now, the interesting thing is they didn't achieve it, and they were beaten back in 2022. 2022, as I mentioned, was the year of big success of Ukraine, but you probably know this. They came close to the gates of Kiev, and they had paratroopers dropped inside the city. So it was a very close-run thing. And I think that calculation was based on Putin's belief that this would be an easy war. Whether he sincerely believed it or not, he and his advisors seemed to have told other people close to the circle that the Ukrainians were start defecting, that the Ukrainian army was a mess. It couldn't stand up to the Russians. And I think Putin fell victim to hubris. Now, what's happened since then? There's an old saying, I think attributed to Voltaire, I can't remember who, God is on the side of the bigger battalions. I mean, the sheer mass in terms of manpower and armor and artillery and armored personnel carriers has enabled the Russians to carry out last year, 2024, this grinding war of attrition where they've worn out and slowly push back Ukrainian troops, regardless of the casualties they've suffered. Having said that, if you look at the front line now, the Russians are bringing fewer and fewer armored vehicles to the front. They're increasingly relying on things like Chinese golf carts and passenger cars and passenger vehicles, sometimes even donkeys. The number of people that they're throwing to the front has decreased somewhat, but it's all relative. The question is not whether Russia has problems, right? It's a question of, does Ukraine have bigger problems? And I would say unquestionably that is indeed the case. It's not been, if you look at in the grand scheme of things, a great performance by the Russian army, because Russia is the second superpower in the world, the only other superpower in the world. When the war began, most intelligence analysts in this country, the United States, expected that Kiev would fall in 72 hours. We are now entering the fourth year of the war. I don't think anybody, certainly not I, thought that Ukraine would be able to stand up to Russia for this long. It's an extraordinary thing, actually.
Yeah, you mentioned in the first days of the war, there was this offensive against Kiev, and even today you see the marks of that offensive in the sense there were destroyed buildings in the suburbs. There's terrible massacres happening in Bucha and other places which are not that far from the city center, and there's still a sense of fortification of Kiev. There's checkpoints, pretty heavy military presence. And when you talk to people who were there at that time, it really did seem that the Russians had tried to do this sweeping decapitation regime change in Kiev because people were forced to distribute AK-47s on street corners to defend the ordinary citizens of the country. And they did repel this attack because it had been somewhat ineptly conceived, I suppose, or it was not. It underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian defense. But there was that took place. There was definitely an attempt to remove the government in a very rapid manner, which is stalled. But I'm curious your perspective. There's now Russia has reframed its goals around controlling this area, the Donbas. What is specifically strategically vital about this region for Russia, or have they retrofitted their objectives to fit which is what's more reasonable, or is there a reason that they'd like to control this area for resources or some political buffer? How do you see their interest in that region?
Right. Good question. So it's been a long-standing tradition, but somewhat misleading, for people to classify Ukraine in the following way. The further east you go from Kiev, you go into Russophone regions. That is to say, not that everybody's pro-Russian, but that the proportion of Russian speakers, those whose native tongue is Russian as opposed to Ukrainian, increases substantially. And the further west you go, the proportion of Ukrainian speakers increases substantially. That is true to the extent that large parts of Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union fairly late. What is special about Donbas? It is the kind of Russophone heartland, if you will. It is the industrial, coal mining, old-style kind of Dickensian industrial zone. So I would say that it's important for that reason. It's also the part of Ukraine that directly abuts Russia, and it provides a kind of buffer between Ukraine and Russia. One of the pieces of Putin's narrative has been that one of the reasons that he launched the war is that Ukraine's Russian-speaking community had been systematically discriminated against. So in a sense, to the extent that he feels that that is the case, and we can talk about the extent that that's been the case, that is also something that makes Donbas particularly important. But the other reason that he's focused on Donbas is that he's been mired in Donbas. He hasn't been able to lock it up and move on to other areas. I think if he had his druthers, he would sweep through Donbas, go to the next neighboring province, which is Dnipropetrovsk. They're not far away, by the way, and then move on to take the rest of Zaporizhia and Kherson and say, I've achieved my objectives. I've now annexed all 4 provinces in which I conducted this referendum in September of 2022, which is kind of a bogus referendum, but that's beside the point. He believes that the referendum has shown that the Ukrainians in those four provinces have voted irrevocably to join Russia. So those are his territorial aims. But at the moment, the Ukrainians have given him a run for his money, partly because, and you have visited, I know, these drone factories. There's a cottage industry of drone factories in Ukraine. Not only have they made life difficult for Russian soldiers and Russian artillery and tanks and armored personnel carriers, they've also been used systematically over and over again to hit rare areas, so ammunition dumps, but especially oil and gas facilities, to try to cripple, and if not cripple, to crimp Russia's logistical capacity, that is, the ability to move stuff, including men and equipment and food and petroleum and oil and lubricants, to the front.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible watching the way that both sides, but especially the Ukrainian side, in my opinion, has managed to improvise during the war and ramp up these drone industries. And you sort of account, and again, in the case of Ukraine, for the imbalance in size and resources, because a lot of these drones that they're using to destroy tanks, cost maybe $1,000 or something like that. They need to kind of make it economical in that sense. I want to go back to something you said earlier about the prospect of a peace deal and how it could come to shape, or how it could be accepted on the Ukrainian side, or at least be palatable politically. It seems at the moment that it's not just that the U.S. is trying to put an end to the war, which I think that everyone, including the Ukrainians and the Russians, would like to see an end to the war itself, but they're rushing through an agreement that's very, very, it seems much more, at least in the way it's been portrayed publicly, much more favorable to the Russian side, and seems to just want to turn the war off like a light switch and end it in that sense. There in Ukraine, there are diversity of opinion, and obviously there is exhaustion about the war, and it's manifesting in these labor shortages and manpower for the military and so forth. But there is a tremendous amount of hostility and also fear of Russia in the population because of their historical experience under Russian control, and also because of the events of the last 2-3 years. I have a sense, and you may know better than me, that it would be very difficult for Zelensky to sell a very, very bad peace agreement to the Ukrainian population, notwithstanding their desire to end the war, because of the fact there are people in Ukraine who are even more hawkish about Russia than Zelensky is, or you could say are there to the right of Zelensky. And you see some of them manifesting in the Ukrainian military or in their governing establishment. And secondly, if there is a peace deal which seems sort of ramshackle, it may suggest that the war may start again in a few years, because of the Ukrainian perspective and the popular level, it's not, the war didn't start in 2022, it actually started in 2014, and it's just been going on and off since that time, and 2022 was the next escalation. So many people do believe that, if you don't get a security guarantee, the country is going to face war again. And, that also ties to something else you said, which is that this issue of Ukrainian refugees. And it seems to me that, if there's not a good peace deal, refugees may not come back, because why would you go back to a country which, your sons may have to die again in 5 years fighting this much larger power? So you may see that draining out of the country and the evacuation of, the people who are necessary to make sure they have another generation there. So, I say all to say, what is your perception of what a feasible peace deal is in Ukraine? And then secondly, if they have tried to push through a deal which Ukrainians don't like on a popular level, what may happen inside the country?
Right. So a three-part question that you asked. One is the U.S. approach to the war and Donald Trump's rushing to get a settlement. The second is, can Zelensky sell the war? And thirdly, will Russia attack if there's no security guarantee? So let me take them in turn. When I see our present delegation, Marco Rubio, Trump's friend, the real estate tycoon Steve Witkoff, and the National Security Advisor, the Waltz, right, up against the likes of Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. Whatever you may think of the war, Lavrov is one of the most seasoned and able diplomats in the world. He's accompanied by his deputy Ryabkov and Putin's national security advisor Yuri Ushakov. These are formidable characters. And the idea that they can be bamboozled and made to sign a peace agreement in short order, I think, is just naive. But this is what Trump believes, that he's a deal maker, and if he makes the right kind of deal, then there can be a handshake and the war will be over. You recall he said during the campaign that I'll end this in 24 hours. I think the Russians are after much more than a peace deal in Ukraine. They want to be recognized as a country on par with Russia, with the United States and China as a fellow great power. They want the sanctions lifted. They want to enter the G7. They want to have resumed negotiations and exchanges on all manner of things from trade to arms control. That is, they have a much wider agenda here. And I think Putin's belief is that time is on his side, that it is, after all, the Americans who said, we would like to talk peace with you, not the reverse. And I don't think he's going to rush into this deal. There are some in the Trump administration who believe that one of the reasons the United States must sign this deal is to peel Russia away from China so that China can be weakened further to help the American containment policy against China. Now, ask yourself this: if you were Vladimir Putin, what would you do? Ditch China, with whom you've had for a long time a tried, true, and trusted relationship, economically, militarily, politically, and then move into the American camp, or maximize your leverage by maintaining good relations with both sides? It's obvious that he's going to do the latter. So I think these expectations of a quick deal, that Russia is eager to sign on the dotted line, that we will break faith with China, I think all misplaced. Now, can Zelensky sell a peace deal? As you pointed out, and it matters a great deal in what the terms are. The larger the territorial sacrifice he has to make, the more pressure he will face, especially if there is no security guarantee. And by security guarantee, I don't necessarily mean a European force, because the Americans won't participate, Trump's made that clear, that is on the ground in Ukraine to defend Ukraine. I think that's impossible because the Ukrainians want a 200,000 force. The Europeans are talking about a 30,000 person force, which is not going to be enough to deter, level, and defeat Russia if it invades. Zelensky, I think, would settle for entry into NATO and a guarantee of continued Western military support. Now, as regards the first, NATO, this all began in 2008 at NATO's Budapest summit, when then President George W. Bush kind of cajoled and coerced a reluctant, divided NATO into issuing this vague statement that said, one day we look forward to welcoming Ukraine into the alliance. Between 2008 and 2022, when the war began, Ukraine had not made one iota of progress toward NATO membership. The alliance was never keen. So by saying that essentially the door to Ukraine's entry into NATO is closed, Trump is basically saying what everybody who's been paying attention has seen fairly clearly. Now, post-war, you are absolutely correct that the conditions of peace, especially provisions for post-war reconstruction, will have a significant effect on how quickly the refugees come back and how many of them come back. And it stands to reason that the younger and more qualified they are, the more likely that as time has gone by, they have put down, if not roots, then made a life for themselves outside Ukraine. I talked in my last visit to a person about the effect on the solidity of the family, that is, divorce rate and separation rates, among families who've been divided, with women and children in Europe and the men mostly fighting as soldiers. And there is increasing concern that this is taking a toll. So yes, it's going to be a very tough sell. The question really becomes, if Trump washes his hands of Ukraine and decides he's not going to provide military equipment, even if Europe steps in and ramps up production and supplies, which he can do, but not to the extent necessary to backfill the American departure, Ukraine is going to start losing more and more territory, barring some exhaustion of Russia. Now, the good news for Ukraine is that in the last, I would say, 3 weeks to a month, the operational tempo, that is, the size of the Russian troop presence on the front line and the pace at which they're moving, has slowed because of heavy losses and because Ukrainian drones have become very, very formidable. But if you were to ask me who at this point still has the advantage, there's no question that it's Russia.
You came to a very important point, which I want to address about the precipitating factors that led to the war. Very interestingly, in recent days, the U.S. administration, the Trump administration, has been stating something which the U.S. had not stated before, which is that they believe that, or they've been implying that actually the blame for the cause of the war was actually Western actions, or, these invitations, however vague or specific about future Ukrainian membership in NATO or future Ukrainian integration with the EU more generally. And obviously in the US, this is a very, very heated debate because many people who were opposed to the war or have a different view of the war have taken the view that the US actually triggered the conflict and provoked Russia, you could say, to invade Ukraine. What is your view of this actually? And I know it's a very difficult question, but like, how do you conceive the events which led up to it? And how do we apportion, if not blame, but apportion causality to what took place in 2014 and again in 2012 more recently?
Yeah, you put your finger on what is arguably the central item in the debate, certainly among strategists and within the academy, in academia, shall I say. So on the one hand, you have people like John Mearsheimer who say, had it not been for Ukraine's prospective membership in NATO, and more broadly NATO expansion, the war would never have happened. And Russia at some point felt that it could not tolerate Ukraine in NATO, and it decided to launch a war. And the result will be that Ukraine would be crushed. What the West has done is to lead Ukraine along the primrose path and leave it at the abyss of danger. On the other side, you have people such as Anne Applebaum and Timothy Snyder, who argue that this has nothing to do with NATO expansion. This is a kind of ingrained Russian expansionism, the quest for empire that has deep roots in Russian history, but in the modern age is personified by Vladimir Putin. I come down, you ask me what my position is, it's roughly this. I was opposed to NATO expansion from the get-go because I believe that after the end of the Cold War and the advent of Gorbachev, and then subsequently Yeltsin, there was a historic opportunity to redesign the security order in Europe. Instead, we chose, for complicated reasons, to not only retain NATO, but to expand it, partly because NATO guarantees American preponderance and a permanent presence and influence in Europe. And there was also considerable pressure and lobbying exercised here on behalf of East Central European countries, especially Poland, who wanted to join NATO. So did NATO expansion poison the well of US-Russian relations? Unquestionably. It is, I think, completely wrong to lay this completely at Mr. Putin's feet because Boris Yeltsin, from the beginning, said that he could not understand why the United States, on the one hand, would say, the Cold War is over, you are our friend and partner, we have embraced a democratic Russia, and then simultaneously take a Cold War alliance and march it steadily toward Russia's border. So I was not a proponent of NATO expansion. But you can take that position and still take the position that the precipitating cause of this war was not the prospective entry of NATO into Ukraine. And I've asked many people on the other side, can you show me any evidence that between 2008 and 2022, there was something that happened that led Putin to believe that unless he acted on February 24th, 2022, by launching what turned out to be the largest land war in Europe, that Ukraine was on the verge of entering NATO? I know of no such evidence. Now, this, of course, puts me in a difficult position because people then ask me, well, what is your explanation for the war? And I'll confess to you that I don't have one. I have a kind of theory that I'll sell you just off the cuff, and that is this. During the COVID isolation, we know that Putin, who reads widely in Russian history, was asking for the imperial archives to be brought to him. Perhaps he was thinking of his mortality, and as a legacy, he asked for the archives of Peter the Great, especially Catherine the Great, under whose reign large parts of what is now Ukraine were taken and annexed to the Russian Empire. And I wonder whether he thought, A, that he'd like to leave a legacy, which is to set right what he believes should never have happened, the separation of Russia and Ukraine, and more importantly, to make it almost impossible for Ukraine at any point to join NATO. But I don't think that there was an existential threat that Russia faced on the eve of the war by way of Ukraine's membership in in NATO. But it's impossible to resolve this debate because people are starting from irreconcilable premises.
Oh, I think you did a very good job of parsing the complexity there because there is these two simultaneous things which are both true, but yet there's some sort of a difference there. I'll tell you, it's very funny. I'm sure you've encountered this too, but Ukrainians are, have a very humorous and cynical sort of response in many cases. I talked to a lot of people in Ukraine about what they thought the reason was. They thought that, well, Putin was bored and Russia was bored. There were people in the Kremlin were bored, so they just said, oh, the COVID lockdown's going on. Let's do this thing, which we thought would be very easy. And obviously the major geopolitical event just before that had been the collapse of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So there was a sense that some of these peripheral territories of the Western Alliance may be susceptible to being pushed over at the moment. And obviously they miscalculated because the war is still going on at great cost. But, there is this ongoing debate. But I think that your explanation, it does help contextualize things in a very nuanced way.
Can I add a quick point, though? I've made this before, so I'll be brief. I think that in addition to the COVID isolation, there are two other things. Once Putin decided to initiate the war, he's never called it a war, he's called it a special military operation, right? Nobody in his inner circle had the temerity to stand up and tell the boss, we don't think this is a great idea. You may remember that famous scene, I forget when it happened, but it was some months before the war, where Putin was seated at his desk and all of the major panjandrums of the national security and foreign policy officialdom were about several feet away, and they were all essentially asked to stand up and praise the special military operation. And one of them, I think Sergei Narishkin, then the head of the domestic intelligence service, didn't do so to Putin's satisfaction, and he was dressed down. And it became quite clear that if you disagree with Putin, you want to keep it to yourself, and you don't want to go not just public with it, but you don't want to even tell him to his face. So the problem was there was nobody to get him out of this bubble. If in fact it was the case that he thought, I can do this now and I can do it quickly and I can do it successfully.
It's a great point, and this is something which I try to, even it's hard for me to understand myself because, obviously in the U.S. administration makes terrible decisions all the time, disastrous and immoral and so forth, but the nature of decision making in a system where one person is very, very important or maybe all important is just very different. You get different outcomes. And one person's will, and every person is fallible, regardless of what role they're in. It can be quite disastrous for an entire country. And in this case, you mentioned, I do remember that scene. It was very clear that what his view of the situation was determinative, and it's something scary to oppose if you did have any objection to it. So yeah, I think that.
But to be fair, you may remember that during the Iraq War, right, it was not that George W. Bush was the equivalent of Putin, a kind of all-commanding figure who could snap his fingers and get people to do what they wanted. He had very strong-willed people like Donald Rumsfeld and so on in his cabinet, but they formed their own bubble, self-reinforcing groupthink bubble, and it turned out that anyone who dissented was either seen as not very intelligent or potentially disloyal. They all began to reinforce one another. So this is very common in war. Either an all-powerful leader who thinks he can do something and nobody has the guts to stand up and say this is a terrible idea, or a small circle that settles on an idea, reinforces itself, and comes to see dissenters as disloyal.
Yeah, I find that in the U.S. there's a very, very powerful sort of force. I think that Ben Rhodes, a former advisor to Obama during his term, he said that he referred to it as the blob. And the blob was this sort of echo chamber which could be created. And, it's not that you would be necessarily arrested for your views, but you could, if you're espousing a view which is outside what is deemed the orthodoxy at the moment, your views could be very thoroughly marginalized, and you yourself could be marginalized or deemed outside the scope of a respectable conversation, even if later on you turn to be right, which has happened many, many times in the past.
Right.
Which is why it's very...
There's also, if I might, just very quickly, a certain hubris within the American foreign policy establishment. After the Cold War, the belief was we won. And we won because we were a better country, economically more efficient, militarily more powerful, but above all, a democratic country. So this was the triumph of good over evil. You may remember much later on, Madeleine Albright said, We are the United States. We stand taller and see further than anybody else. There is this claim to this omniscience, and I think that kind of hubris almost never ends well. It didn't end well in Iraq. And even if Putin wins this war, whatever one may mean by win, remember that about 700,000 Russians have been killed and wounded. The defense budget now accounts for 40% of the overall state budget. There's a labor shortage. Interest rates are at 21%, choking off investment. And inflation, which is about 9.9%, is twice the targeted figure of the Russian central bank. These are all figures from Russia. These are not my numbers. One has to ask, at the end of the day, was it worth it, given that there wasn't a threat equivalent to, say, the invasion of Nazi Germany? I mean, everybody understood that Stalin had to respond to that because it would have meant the end of the Soviet Union. Was there something equivalent or even close to being equivalent? So this is where I disagree with that he had to do it because of NATO expansion school of thought. That's a very powerful school of thought, by the way. It has its own groupthink, but I won't say that I'm not guilty of my own mini groupthink. So,
Rajan, I want to ask you one final question, and it alludes to something you mentioned earlier. Obviously, there's a discussion now of what an end state of the war may look like. The U.S. has said it would not deploy troops as part of any peacekeeping or buffer sort of force between Russia and Ukraine. The Europeans have expressed the European Union has expressed some interest in doing so, but far, far less than what the Ukrainians are asking for and what's likely to be efficacious in actually deterring a Russian attack. You know, this all ties back into almost like the whole post-World War II world is being called into question right now, because the Europeans had always counted on this NATO alliance to be their shield to defend them against external threats. As a result of that comfort, they built these welfare states, and they built an entire society based around this assumption, in fact. And now it seems that, if not in specifically, but at least by implication, the U.S. is very strongly under this administration, taking almost a hostile stance to these post-war institutions like the European Union and NATO and so forth. And it doesn't seem clear to me at all that the Article 5 requirements for one member to defend another, or the U.S. to defend Europe from any external threat, necessarily is something you could take to the bank in a crisis. It seems like grave questions are emerging about that. What do you see as the significance historically of all these events we're seeing right now, where the U.S. seems to be turning away from Europe, and Europe is sort of adrift and unsure how to deal with its borders or how to deal with external threats in a way it has for the last maybe 80 years?
I think two things are clear to me and probably to you. If not, we can talk about it. One is that for the first time, even people who are strong Atlanticists in the United States, which is to say almost the entire foreign policy establishment, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party pre-Trump, are asking the question, is the transatlantic relationship as we know it dead and buried? No one's ever asked this question before, to the best of my knowledge, since 1949 when NATO was formed. But the second and narrower question is NATO unraveling? Recall that yesterday, Friedrich Merz, whose Christian Democratic Party is likely to form the government, even though it has only about 29% of the vote, said he believed that the United States is no longer committed to the defense of Europe, that this represents a very significant rupture, and that Europe will have to look for itself. Two other points. You remember the talk that Vice President Vance gave to Europe recently at the Munich Security Conference. If you had to design a speech to demean and insult and anger the Europeans, you couldn't have done it better. It was a speech that oozed contempt. And then he went ahead and refused to meet with Chancellor Scholz. Germany is the most powerful economy in Europe, arguably the most important country on the continent. He didn't meet with him, but he went and met with the AfD leader, Alice Weidel. Extraordinary. And then before that, you had Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth say, listen, you've got to do more in your own defense. We're going to withdraw forces and focus more on other areas. I think he meant East Asia. So I think there's been a clear indication from the Trump administration that they have a very different view of transatlantic relations than any previous president, either Republican or Democrat. So to this extent, there is certainly a sea change, and Europe has some very big decisions to make because for a long time, it has been able to focus on the welfare state, minimize defense spending because the 1-800-USA number was always available. All of a sudden now they have to do something for which there isn't a lot of support, ramp up defense spending. If you do that, something else has got to give by way of social programs. And get used to doing something that the European establishment has never had to really seriously think about. What does the security of Europe look like if you are cut adrift from the United States?
Rajan, thanks so much for chatting with us today.
Thanks, Murtaza. Good to be with you.
That was Rajan Menon, a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. And that does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our podcast feed by searching for Dropside News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review as it helps other listeners to find us as well. Our show today was produced by Jose Oliveras. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsidenews.com. If you have the funds to do so, please do become a paid subscriber. All of our content is free for anyone, but our paid subscribers are the fuel that keeps our engine running. Make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, and please do share our work. This program was made possible, in part, by a grant from The Intercept. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Murtaza Hussain.